if you're just getting into this, right? What you have to do is you have to look at what your primary verticals are that you're going after or that you service, and then you have to figure out what compliance frameworks fit in that for the primary ones, right? And hope for the best that your other customers aren't at this point tomorrow going to call you and say, hey, I need compliance, right? But also it's okay to start to figure out ways over time to become the expert in one specific vertical. So you have to kind of limit your frameworks to make sure that they're all complementary to each other and they're complementary to your client base. And then don't try and spread yourself too thin, right? Don't say I do compliance management. Okay, well, what is compliance management? Okay, here's 15 compliance frameworks that I do, right? Because that's, I mean, I don't know anybody that's going to do 15 compliance frameworks. But you could start with one. And then one of the things, like when we were evaluating FortMesa, that you could start with one product, like one compliance framework, and then align that using a product like FortMesa to say, hey, here's how it aligns to other compliance frameworks. And so could we actually take on other compliance frameworks as well?
Yeah, so it's as you're talking, I'm realizing for many of our viewers, they should consider that, first of all, you don't need to learn all the frameworks and all the standards, right? You just basically need to know, like, title of standard, what industry it's in. Is it preeminent or not? Is it required by the government or not? That's not as hard to figure out as you think. It's the details of the standards that are hard. But there's another thing that really makes things easier, that, as you just mentioned, choose a primary. And that's easy, actually, because while there may be, like, we run across a lot of government regulations, right? Or industry standards. They are not security standards. There is a few security standards out there. And in fact, none of the compliance frameworks we've discussed on this call so far, and let me just go over them real quick: NIST 800-171, CMMC, NIST CSF, GLBA. I mentioned FTC. You just mentioned another one. It was SOC 2.
Yeah.
None of those are security standards. They are compliance standards, and every single one of them requires that you refer to a technical security standard. So as an MSP, starting with a technical security standard makes sense, because you can take that single technical security standard and it's the center of your star, right? You can map it out. Yeah, FFIC. There's another one. You can take that center of your star and you relate that to all the other standards. You deploy this security one time and you can comply with all the standards. So just as examples of technical security standards, guys, here's the big ones: CIS controls, right? NIST 853, not 171, 853, right? ISO 27K, right? There's probably a single COBIT fan here I'm watching, and if I don't call it out, they're gonna yell at me. But you got to drop COBIT in there. That's basically it. That's basically it. Every other security standard refers to those. There are some other security standards out there, but they're all derivatives, right? You pick one of those 4 or 5, run your practice on it, and then anytime a customer has any regulatory compliance questions, you don't reinvent your security planning, right? All you do is map your current practices, which you've already recorded in that core technical framework, right? You map it over, and there's lots of good places where you can get those mapping guides.
Think about it this way, okay? You have 2 things. You have one thing, which is, like, we'll call it your controls, right? Your security controls or an industry standard. You have another side of it, which is a compliance framework.
Yeah.
The compliance framework is a regulatory requirement that has been created or enacted or written into some kind of code that's being required by law of a company or a business for them to follow that, or for them to adhere to it, or maybe it's a commercial business to business transaction. They're just referencing it, right? But they wrote that to reference the industry standard because they needed to codify it somehow. Because the industry standard doesn't mean, just because somebody puts an industry standard out doesn't mean that they're going to follow the industry standard, right? But if they're able to codify that and say, okay, we made that into a law, we've created a compliance requirement for that, well, now the industry standard has become law in essence.
The compliance standard is the list of things you have to do to be compliant with that industry, and sometimes that's complicated because there's different rules for different organizations. And the security standard, it's technical. It tells you how to do a thing properly. It tells you how to measure that thing properly. It breaks it down into a bazillion dictionary entries, right? It's an encyclopedia of possible things you can do in security, right? And the compliance standards tell you, well, you need to do these things, and we don't care about those other things, right? And the other thing you'll find in those compliance standards are things that are specific to an industry, right? Like high trust is a healthcare industry standard, right? So there's a million references to PHI. The core technical standard doesn't mention PHI because it's a generic standard for all information, right? So you do need to pair them up. There's no such thing as a one size fits all. It's very typical that an organization that invests deeply in security will have at least two standards that they need to worry about: one compliance standard, right, and one security standard. It's very normal to have, as you continue to invest, have even more. In line with what I'm talking about, hub and spoke, guys, PCI DSS is the payment card industry standard. In the United States, although not everywhere in the world, there's a strong healthcare industry law, HIPAA. Those are two separate compliance standards. Neither of them are complete from a technical perspective. So you need a complete technical framework to design your security for your security architecture, and then you evaluate it on PCI and you evaluate it on healthcare.